So today we'll talk about the whole microclimate and within your architectural design, uh, also in your integrated design studios, how you can actually use certain kind of elements and components which will help you in creating these climate responsive spaces, but, but also at the same time also create this entire microclimate which is immediate to your buildings. So. um, So the climatic factors that governs the utilization of spaces. Now, the two examples that we have got you is about one is about this urban piazza, which is there, wherein you would see that this entire piazza is being vacant or not being used, especially during the afternoons when the sun is, you know, right on your head and there is a lot of heat which is generated. And because it's an urban environment, it'll definitely also have a kind of a urban heat island effect as well. But at the same time, the same piazza becomes like a very active space in the evenings when the sun intensity has reduced. So it's all about that how humans try and utilize certain kind of spaces, especially the common recreational spaces, depending on the climate responsiveness. On the other side, you have the Boston City Hall Plaza, which actually expands on over the hard surfaces with very few or no trees around. So, which means there is hardly any shade. And that's why during summers, the solar radiation load is very high, and people using the plaza would be uncomfortable. Not much of it's very hot during that time. In winters, the cold winds blow unobstructedly through the area, creating uncomfortable colder conditions then as well. So these are the two very different examples where one you're talking about this expanse vast land which doesn't have any kind of wind barrier in extreme climates, neither the solar barrier. And then there is another space which do have a certain structures which club together. So there is a certain kind of shadowing pattern, but still during summers, which is one of the extreme climate, people find it difficult to utilize. Now, this is a very classic example wherein there is actually one talk going on, and people are really interested in going, to listen the talk. But because the space is being overcrowded, the people actually choose to distance it out from the top where they can barely hear anything, but at the same time, but they are still comfortable. So they are actually trying to sit where the shade is of the particular tree. So the question here comes, does comfort govern the state of mind and body of an individual? Definitely, yes, it does govern. So as architects, we have to be very careful when we are designing these spaces, especially when we are talking about the indoor-outdoor relationship. This is another example which is actually about the cave architecture. Now, it is a very deserted landscape, but the cave still is facing towards the south. Okay, and still it's comfortable, and we are talking about hot desert. Now, if anecdotally, if I think about hot desert, I have to make sure that I safeguard my building from the south, because there is going to be a constant solar energy which is going to hit my facades. But here, because we are talking about the cave, and the cave dwellings are much more interiors, and it doesn't have any amount of daylight, and also it doesn't have a kind of a wind, okay, because you're not talking about a cross ventilation here, and that's why it is good to face to the south. But the whole thermal mass of the cave itself, the rock itself, acts like a shelter from this extreme climatic condition. This is in another, modern style house in Tucson, Arizona, and it is very, climatically very appropriate because it has these long overhangs. It has these nice apron pavings that extends out like a deck from the, floor of your house, and it also has these, floor to ceiling windows onto the south, because your winters are going to be very harsh. So you need to invite as much sun as you want. This is in another building, which is actually the first national university building. Okay, it's in Regina, and it has actually floors. So this is the first building which actually demonstrates the stacked floors, but it is actually wherein, the cantilever, the floors are being staggered. Okay, so they do project out as you go higher to just create the self-shading mechanism for the entire site. And that is actually because there is hardly any microclimate which is being created around. Because similar to the Boston Plaza or the city area, here also you have this entire vast expanse of land, absolutely no tree around. Now, this is a typical image of any kind of an urban city or an urban scenario where you see a lot of built form which is there around you, and there's hardly any kind of ecology or environment in terms of your trees or vegetation left around. And it's talking about this organic growth across of these blocks. Okay, so let's understand these four climate components and the behavioral patterns of it. So one is, it's talking about, the first image actually talks about that you actually can't see with your naked eye that how the sun is going to hit the facades of your building. And that's why, one sec guys, let me have water. Yeah. So this actually image talks about that if I am, trying to pour water on a barrier or a kind of a partition, this is the way the water is going to spill out, and some is going to percolate and some is going to spread over the surface and some is going to evaporate. Similarly, when the sun is incident onto any surface, there is some which is get absorbed, there is some which gets radiated, and there is some which gets diffused within the atmosphere. Another example is about this human being, which is standing in a tree shade and standing without the tree shade. Now, what happens is there is no difference in temperature if I go with a thermometer and check that. Okay, but the whole idea of that sun hitting onto my head directly makes me much more comfortable. Okay, if I have a tree cover over my head. So thermal comfort level will be caused by the other factors, and it's not because that the temperature difference occurs. Okay, it's not going to be because look at the proximity at which what they are standing. Then we talk about how we are being located onto the Earth's surface. So definitely we talk about the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Okay, so here we are talking about at the beginning of the summers in the northern hemisphere, the sun is at its highest point in the southern sky. So a person in Atlanta will cast a very short shadow. So depending on where you are and the sun's altitude hitting you, the casting of the shadow happens. So the longer shadow and the shorter shadow is all about that. Okay. If you want to experiment this, your morning sun, the kind of shadow that it casts compared to the afternoon sun is going to be different. The other component is about the water or the humidity. Okay, so the image actually talks about it's nothing but it's these set of pancakes, and if actually when you pour, any kind of a liquid form over it, and the kind of the way it is going to release onto the surface and also maneuver through the surface, it's all depending on the topography of the surface, and that's how your streams and valleys and things like that gets generated. So whenever you're talking about a microclimate, all these components are very important because their behavioral patterns are impactful for your design. The other one is the wind. So this on the left hand side, that's actually the conceptual layout of your windrows diagram, which actually talks about that there are two kinds of winds that are happening. So if you see, if we are talking about the winter, the wind blows from the east and the northeast. Okay, uh, but at the same time, if you actually look at the winter summers, it's going to be some from also going to come from the west, and it's also from the south. Okay, so then how do you create? So it's about the north and the south, okay? And because there are these variations in the wind directions, you have to cater for the seasonal changes as well. Then how you can actually use the elements of the microclimate to create these changes or to cater to those changes. The above diagram actually talks about the air movement. So whenever you are facing a wind direction, you are always on the positive side, okay, of the wind. Once it moves through your building, on the other side is the negative side because you're not facing the wind direction. So what happens is it's actually the leeward side which is there. This is much more better in terms of understanding that how the wind flows through the solid structures. So whenever the wind is always traveling with a certain kind of velocity, okay, which is depicted in meters per second. Now, whenever there is this structure or any kind of building, it creates an obstruction. So either the wind is going to, it obviously going to brush through the sides of the building and move ahead. But when it's doing that, the velocity of the wind is cut down majorly. Yeah. And you can see also there is this between this on the right side, there are these two tall buildings which are there. And you get this kind of a pocket which doesn't have wind at all, which is immediately after the uh, building facade on the back side. And that is called the leeward side. Okay. And these arrows which are called, they are called the vortex. Okay, the vortex is nothing but the way the wind is being blowing through. Now, on the left hand side, you're talking about the build structures, but on the right hand side, you're actually talking about the topography. So the undulation of the land also has a certain kind of impact on the way the wind moves. Okay, so you can actually use these kinds of earth berms or depressions, or creating these high elevated surfaces around your site just to create this kind of uh, movement for the winds to move through. This is a very good example which actually talks about various elements of microclimate, your solar radiation, terrestrial radiation, winds, air temperature, air humidity. And if you want to make it feel cooler, you use the ones which are on the extreme left hand sides of it, and the ones to make it feel warmer, you can use the on the extreme right side. Like for example, in the air temperature, your wet ground depression is required because the moment your soil is going to be wet, okay, there is a certain kind of temperature that gets dropped, but there is going to be increase in the humidity. So depending on what kind of a climate you want to, you are designing in, you have to take care of whether you want to just have a moistened soil or you want to, place a water body so that it also adds the humidity. But when you move towards the warmer, you actually go for dry, dark surfaces. So which means darker the surfaces, more absorption of heat is going to happen. So these are, smaller instances which talks about how do you create a microclimate using your solids or your, vegetation, or keeping it much more open, or you're using any kind of other reflection, materials. Then talking about how do you cool your ground, your sky around. So only vegetation doesn't work because sometimes you're also dealing with climates wherein you require to cut off the sun during summers, but in winters you still want it. So you'll definitely go for a tree which sheds its leaves during the winters, so that the sun passes through the trees and still enters your house. But at the same time, in summers you don't want it, so that the tree filters out the sunlight. Then the whole placement becomes very important. These are the other elements which talks about creating, a fence oriented to the east or the west provides shade in the morning and evening, casting a longer shade in the winters and shorter shade in the summers. So it's just about the same fence, how different it's going to behave. On the right hand side, it's about the stone wall, which is nothing but the whole thermal mass. Because of its ability to absorb the larger radiations of the sun, it can, absorb the whole sun's heat throughout the day, and in the night when you require it, it can radiate out or, you know eliminate it. So then the kind of compound walls or the kind of recreation spaces that you or the paraphernalia that you create around your building can also help you to generate that microclimate that you desire. The other thing is about the trellis or the semi-open spaces that you want to create, which if you have a deck that's overlooking in another water body or things like that, and that deck should have a kind of a pergola, but that pergola you don't want to make it closed. But then what you do is you use these creepers that can grow along and things like that. So you can use them in winters differently and in summers differently. Then talking about the deciduous trees and the coniferous trees, wherein you need to understand that which tree should be placed in which direction and for what purposes. Now, along with these, it's also very important to look at the whole topography. Okay. Now, the topography is also very important because, especially in the contour side, the siting of the building becomes very crucial because there is a certain kind of stormwater that runs through the hill slopes. And when it's running through the hill slopes, there is a lot of soil erosion that can occur. And that's why these landslides happen. And when the eroded soil gets deposited, it's called the colluvial and fossil soil. So can you see the curve which is there? It all shows that the kind of an empty space wherein soil is already eroded and deposited somewhere else. So which means there is a constant change that is happening onto the topography of the landform. And also you need to understand that which are the well-drained soils and which are the ones which have groundwater and inundated soils. Inundated soils are nothing but it doesn't have, it doesn't hold, uh, it will erode over the period of time. Okay, and you will always have water present in those soils. It's not moisture, but it's much more. So it's a proper water content that is present in that soil, and also the groundwater is going to be higher in those areas. So again, your foundation, the kind of spreading of the materials that you want to use, the spread of your entire plan and things like that becomes very important. Now, this is the whole kind of a kind of a map which talks about that regarding a micro. When you're talking about a microclimate, all these factors matter. When you talk about air temperature, you need to understand the movements of the aerosols and the dust particles. So you're talking about pollution. You need to understand the dissipation that is there. You need to understand, in terms of your landscape morphology and the whole macroclimate, what happens. So in the macroclimate, your wind directions, which are being generated on the larger. So in the first year when we saw about the El Nino and the Albedo, those are the macroclimates. So those have an impact on, but it doesn't have directly on the impact on your microclimate, but definitely it impacts your wind direction. Then your local rainfall and the fog. Then in terms of your air humidity, sometimes the humidity is so high. So you will come across a certain kind of trees and species of plantations which have the ability to curtail down that humidity. Then there is this whole idea of the dew formation, the presence of the pests and the diseases. Then we talk about the soil temperature, the water retention, or the ability of the soil to hold the water. So a lot of the time, whenever you are talking about, placing the microclimate strategies, one of the strategies you might talk about moistening the bed. Now, in that, you want to percolate the storm water into the groundwater. But understand if there is a thick layer of clay soil as your top soil, okay, on this side, it's not going to percolate, which means you have to ensure that when you cut across the earth's crust, earth, you need to ensure that the perforated or your percolation pit cuts across the clay, you know, slab, and then only you can ensure that there is a groundwater recharge that happens. Then there is a soil moisture, which talks about the whole idea of the nitrogen fixation, the germination. So the whole nutrient value of the soil matters. So if you are looking at like we saw the example of Krishi Bhavan, right? So it's an agricultural thing. So which means that the agriculture becomes a very important function. And then in that, you have to understand what is the nitrogen fixation becomes a very important thing. Your heat conductivity or the heat per volume, the whole function of the germination, whether it happens or not. So all these are basically, it's talking about the ecosystem, which is nothing but creating your microclimate around your buildings. Now, this is the typical urban microclimate. So you will have a different rural microclimate and you will have a different urban microclimate. Now, within that urban microclimate here, the basically this is just a conceptual diagram which actually talks about that in a dense urban fabric, if you have a close proximity to a forest land or a hillside, okay, which is nothing but a nice biodiversity hotspot area. So you could actually imagine if I cut across Sanjay Gandhi National Park or an RA Milk colony and go right across the Malad Creek, okay, so you have RA Milk colony, which is a dense forest like ecology. Then you have this dense urban fabric, which is concrete, totally concretized blocks, high rises all over, and seamlessly you go towards the creek side. Okay. Now here, the architects and the planners are trying to extend the entire ecology of the RE Milk colony or this green patch that was shown in the diagram, and they are saying that let's connect and create this entire belt, which actually gives a certain kind of breathing space or a whole idea of ecology for the thick urban environment, which is much more concretized. They are doing nothing, but they are trying to create an immediate microclimate for this urban dense fabric which is there. Okay. And that's why that is the role of the microclimate, which is very important, especially in the city like Mumbai, which is a megapolis, where the urban heat island effect is very prominent. Urban heat island effect is nothing but the experiencing higher temperatures in the inner city compared to the ones at the peri-urban areas. Okay, and the difference that we are talking about is 4 degrees to 6 degrees, which is a large. Let's run through these examples of microclimate. Now, this is your community. It's a Dong Bang, Vietnam building. So it was executed in the year of 2017. Area is 300 square meters. So you can see this black L, inverted L patch, which is there. That's where the site is. It's actually not quite far from a large polluted industrial area. So, and that's why there is a certain kind of uh, uh, high construction density is also there. At the same time, there is a certain kind of pollution which is there. So this project is being imagined as a center that focuses on the cultural and artistic aspects on the periodical basis, among which the coffee space is much of the daily activity. So it's more like a community space that they have created. The whole idea or the concept inspiration comes from the beauty of the national landscape of the Kemtrong, situated between the two provinces uh, within, in Vietnam. And it talks where the illegal rock mining is gradually turning this famous place into ruins. So what is happening that all the, once the mining is being done, it's going to be a man-made landscape. And because there is so much of negative environmental impact that has occurred on the site, it is not going to create any kind of recreational spaces for the people there. So the concept makes use of the waste, reusing scaffolding, steel pipes, collecting rock debris from Kentron, discarded rocks from the trade villages and construction sites to express the treasure, nostalgia, regret of local people at the bygones of the landscape, which means that you have already utilized the natural resource, but there are a lot of products that you have been generated in that entire process, and those products need to be upcycled. So this project talks about that. So it actually has this, so that's the site. So 11 is there is an existing building which is there. Okay, so 11 are those, and that's the site between. Now this has actually, if you see, has a lot of trees which are being placed. Okay, and those trees are actually being planted by the designers who designed this. So mountains are stone walls, wherein actually they are talking about this the mountains. They have translated the idea of creating this entire stone walls so that the robustness or the kind of heaviness is still being experienced. And but what they did was they have placed them as zigzag intermittently and connected randomly to one another through doors and openings to enable users approach from various directions. So because it's a public building, you can access it from any side. The outer cover is the water surface. Green trees alternate in various positions with different elevations to regulate microclimate, create scenery, and blur the outer inner boundaries, which means they're also talking about the inside outside relationship. Suspended above is a big cloud, which is the same as the image, which is nothing but they have imagined a very lightweight roof and mezzanine floors, which are created by the continuous transfers of steel steps. They have used bamboo sticks which for the roofing and for the flooring, uh, make a fragile but solid elastic structure in contrast to the thickness and tortuous of the rock caves beneath. So which means that you actually utilize in another material or introduce in another material which enhances the whole experience of that place. Let's see how it's been done. So that is what you see is so one is the existing blocks. Those are your randomly placed stone walls, and these are these trees which have been proliferating from that site itself as they have placed it. There is a steel staircase. Now what they have created, there is this bamboo floor, okay, and there are mezzanine slabs as well, and then it has this roofs on the top, okay, which is there. So here actually they are talking about, they call it as S-Space. The project helps raise all alert at unplanned exploitation of natural resources in Vietnam today, which have wiped out many rocks with historical and cultural value, resulting in serious imbalance between the natural ecosystem and the human ones. So architecture bears responsibility for the natural and socio-cultural environment. And that's why they created this entire project. So this is your construction density that it talks about the first. So 300 square meter is what you want. So the walls to shape a space becomes an usual tediousness. You just try to follow the line or a grid pattern which is there. So instead of that, what they did, they break the rigid structure and they want that multi-directional and friendly usage of the space, and because of which they try and create this random uh, you know uh, kind of alignment of walls which gives a certain kind of informality to that space. Now these are certain images of the wall segments which are actually being derived from the debris. So if you see, there are a certain kind of uh, what you say, it has a layer of history attached to it, because you can actually see certain kind of lines, depressions, the way the bamboo or any kind of metal prop would be inserted within those stones. So again, your wall becomes like the whole idea of this archival. And that's how the structure looks like, wherein there is a mountain, which is like the base becomes very robust and your superstructure is much more lightweight. Okay, and that's the water body that runs along. So you have these trees which are being guarded with this pebble kind of, and then that's the entry. This is how the space looks like. So they have actually created these trees and they have used these threads so that with the help of the creepers and other pots are also being placed. Look at the whole bamboo roof which is there, which is so lightweight. Okay, and also when you look at these walls and you're within these spaces, it looks like the cave-like structure. But the whole microclimate helps you to forget that you are in this entire landscape where there's a lot of mining activity happening and there is no, there is hardly any nature left. Now look at the finishes that are being given to the floor and even the pebbles. It just enhances the experience of the user. That's the steel staircases, which is that runs across, goes up. Those are the cutouts in the sky so that the daylight comes in. Even in terms of electricity, it's very light. You have actually done a lot of, the floor is being a cemented, pigmented floor, in situ floor that they have created. That's in another image. That's the whole mezzanine floor with the bamboo, flooring, and then it's been just decked up with this wooden slats finish, and that's the cafe that they're talking about. Look at the railings, it's nothing but it's just the nylon mesh, which is heavy duty, but otherwise they have these steel rod structures which support the roof. That's another image of how people have been utilizing that spaces. Again, your daylight and everything, there is a play of light and shadow. So every time you enter in another space, it is going to be different as the day progresses. Okay, because of the light and shadow play that happens internally. Also, there is a ventilation. So now imagine if I won't have created those kinds of trees, I won't have created that entire water body that I've created. The experience of this space would be very different. Okay, even in terms of your thermal and your visual comfort. And that's why this project was interesting for us to showcase it to you in terms of how in a urban scenario, or even when you have a tight space with existing buildings around you, you can still have the opportunity to create a microclimate for your own building. This is the kind of gravel pebble bed, and that's the water body, the way it touches. There is a sleek like line, the edge that covers, and then there is this corner is being taken up by these grass. And then they have these chick mats, which can roll down, and depending on how whether the sun is too harsh or it's directly hitting your faces when you're sitting at the desk and trying to work on something. Look at the eaves projection which is there. It also becomes very important. And also the pebble pathway along is actually also a kind of a apron paving that we called around your buildings, which are very important to safeguard the foundation and the plinth of your building. Now the whole water has this entire ecology in term or an ecosystem wherein there are fishes and tadpoles. So you can see the clarity of the water which is maintained, because otherwise you're talking about the whole highly polluted area where there is going to be dust and certain kind of emissions as well, because it's also in close proximity to the industrial area. On the left, that's the view on the right side. Sorry, on the night time. And on the right side, that's another edge of how the vegetation takes place, and it's not always the water body that takes over. Look at just the stepping stone pathways which are there, and then you enter these kinds of semi-private spaces which are being created. This is another building which is also very interesting for us because it's actually a wedding hall, uh, but it actually is designed using the idea of Japanese garden. So uh, when you're actually moving through this entire wedding hall, which they call it as the Green Wedding Hall, done by Archipatch, it's in Japan. Uh, it actually, there are certain pauses that the building creates wherein you feel you're a part of the garden and you're not in an urban environment anymore. So they have these 5 blocks. So the building is divided into 5 volumes according to the sizes of the rooms required, and they are arranged in this U shape surrounding the garden. Each volume has deep eaves of different heights extending towards the garden. Okay, so the wedding hall is located near, Ibaraki. Uh, it's basically it's an urban area, and it's in Japan, and the it's all about how the hall melted in the gardens, like the entire form, and actually just melts down, and you become the part of the garden itself. So there is a it the architecture is being done in such a way that it devices to give you a sense of nature, even if you are inside within that architectural space designed. So that's the elevation, which is very simple with your sloping roofs on both sides. And there are nice projections for the eaves that happen. So there is a shelf shadowing as well. And then there is this courtyard space in the sea, which becomes your garden. Now that's the building aerial view, wherein there are these C-shaped, structures which are being laid. And then there is this internal pathway that just connects through the garden. And if you see on the farther side, there are these series of cars which are there in the kind of urbanized space which is being created. Okay, it's very hard paved. Definitely, there will be a presence of urban heat island effect. But the moment you come inside this building, the whole perspective looking changes. Looking at the outdoors. So that's the entry, wherein you have this kind of a dry garden that happens on either sides, and you enter. So the eaves play the role of introducing natural beauty into the interiors, like momentarily changing the shadow of the planting. The water surface of the pond, the soft light reflected on the planting, is there. So there is this another, play of there is another play of light and shadow that occurs, and also there is this kind of a soft reflected ceiling which is there. So again, the materials also is very important, and you can see these chain-like structure dotted that is hanging around. That these are chains, so that the water doesn't, uh, travel along the surfaces, but these chains actually help you to drop down the water faster. So along the chain, the water will be moving down into the pond, and it creates these swirling circles around it. So that is also very one of the elements of the Japanese garden that happens. So because it talks about working on your five senses. So that's the walkway, and look at the how the entire microclimate is being generated. So when you are in this walkway, you won't feel that you are, in this very busy kind of a city with all the urban surroundings. That's the waiting on the lounge area, and that's the garden that you can see on the other side. This is the chapel, which where the wedding ceremony happens. And they have actually used a lot of wood because it's the part of the whole Japanese garden. So it has to look natural, and your whole transition of the indoor and the outdoor becomes seamless. And if you see that the back wall is made up of glass, and what you see is the garden at the back. So you actually feel that when you're in the chapel, you actually feel you're amongst the forest. That's the dining area. So the whole idea of it's actually nothing but it's almost like a banquet hall where a wedding ceremony happens with, where you need a place where the wedding ceremony happens. Then you require the whole services to ensure that the entire wedding ceremony has been facilitated. You have the dining area and you have the waiting area. So those are the kinds of functions. But I truly like the way it's been, you know, ideated. A few of the examples that are being done by our architects. So the famous architect Charles Correa, where he talks about the Sparring House, and he's actually used these two pyramidal sections to form the housing, from housing types developed. One is the summer section and one is the winter section. So whenever, even in the first year, if you remember, I always tell you that make sure your buildings, function for these seasonal changes. So I want to know uh, how your building looks like in the summer and how your building looks like in the winter. And that is exactly what the architect has done here. So the site, since the site faces east-west, the house consists of three bays. The summer section sandwiched between winter section and the service bay. So which means that your services, which is your circulation, kitchen and all that, because it's Ahmedabad, they are going to be on the southern side. So if you see the ground floor plan here, and that's your north, and that's your south. So the longer side is east to west. Okay, and so what you have is you have your bedrooms and your living room, which is facing to your east side. Uh, yeah, I'm right, right? No, yeah. So you enter from the shorter side, and then you have your living room. Then you have your dining space, which becomes like the center. Okay, and it also creates this kind of a courtyard space. So if you see, there are these four pillars, which becomes your rooms on the four corners. Okay, And the same on the top, there are these bedrooms with the terraces that happen. But you do have, because there's a deep plan, you do have a void that has been created. So let's look, that's the house, okay, wherein you have this entire roof of a pergola that projects out so that you shade your entire building. With being Ahmedabad, the sun is going to be, there throughout the day, and you want to safeguard your building from that. Then you have your recessed or sunken windows allowing only diffuse light into the building. Okay, so the your balconies or your openings are not directly onto your external facade, but they are recessed inside. The lowered doors, it also cuts off the heat and directs sun coming from the entrance. So step pyramidal forms of spaces inverting with respect to the season. So for example, if I wanted to see the section. I'll explain you during the section, but this is what the house looks like. This is the kind of shadowing pattern that happens. Okay. Now that's the section, and these are the volumes that we are talking about. Now in the winter, if you see, what happens is there is an entire living that is happening here. Okay. There is a terrace on the top side, and then there is a bedroom that happens on the right. So that is your winter section. Okay. Wherein your bedrooms are facing your south. And then you have a north section, so that the building actually the usage changes. So which means that in the summer you have utilized your dining area, which is your 6 is your dining area. Then there is something which is called the barsati, which is like a much semi-open space which is there on the top. Then you have your 4 are your bedrooms. Now what happens here is the barsati, or even in any of in your summer section, the pergola roof, okay, overcovers your slabs of your bedrooms which are there. So which means the slab of the bedroom is never exposed to the outside. But the pergola becomes like an element to create that microclimate space between, sandwiched between your roof of your bedrooms, which is your 5, which is your barsati. But when you look at the winter section, your sun, you want to hit it onto the roofs because you require, because it's winters, it's going to be low temperatures, and you want the roof to absorb that heat throughout the day, so that when you reside in the night, in these bedrooms, you want that heat to radiate out within your indoor. So it's just creating that cozy environment. Okay, and that's why the pergola roof is lifted out. So it's nothing but it's just a stacking of the volumes which are there. So which means what's that? If I see the plan, okay, that's the living, that's the dining. So which is your right hand side and your left hand side? That becomes that your winter section and your summer section. And it also talks about that how the introverted building morphology of a courtyard, which is your living and the dining in the studio, creates a more livable microclimate for its users, which are these in-between sandwich spaces, okay, which are the stacked ones. So that's how the sun is being shown in the winters, where the altitude of the sun is much more lower, and how does it actually enters the building, okay. And also, as it goes in the afternoon, the altitude will be much more higher and it will hit the roofs of the bedrooms as well. And in the summers, it talks about how the entire stack effect happens, wherein you draw the air from the outdoors, and then internally you have this volume that you have created. It's more like an atrium in your public buildings, which stacks up the hot air and then it releases the hot air from the top. Okay, it's more like the Venturi effect that happens. This is another building which talks about the energy and the resource institutes in the Bangalore. Okay, so what it has done is it has actually created. So TERI is nothing but it's an energy and resource institute. It was established in 1990. This is the Bangalore building, where they are talking about that the orientation of the building is long and narrow side. It's located in a long and narrow side. So where the southern side has an open drain. The primary winds blow from the south to the north. Okay, and that's why you see the longer facade is being facing the north, or the longer elevation is facing in the north south direction, because being Bangalore is going to be warm and humid. So you require, but what happens, Bangalore has much more pleasant temperatures than Mumbai in the evenings. So it's more like a Kolhapur temperature, wherein in the evenings, like after 4 or 5, it's a pleasant atmosphere. It's not as hot as you notice it in Mumbai. Okay, so there is a constant, so longer elevation is being placed in such a way so that the constant cross ventilation is being happen, and you tap all the winds that you have. And also because it's a narrow plot, it's also the daylight becomes very important. Also, they have been creating atrium spaces with skylights, and the section of the building is designed in such a way that natural daylight enters the building, considering and reducing the dependency on the artificial lights. Okay. Uh, it also talks about that the primary winds blow from south to north. The building was oriented along east-west axis, as I mentioned. Maximum exposure along the north and the south, which is the most recommended orientation in the solar passive architecture. The building opens towards the north side, taking advantage of the glare-free light because it's always a diffused light. The wall towards the south is made into a blank wall, allowing the breeze to blow over the building, which in turn creates negative pressure and starts pulling fresh air from the north of the building, which is your lever side. So if you remember that vortex, so as the air just moves across your building, it's going to hit the other surface and come back. So there is a whole lot of vegetation which is also there. Okay, that is being placed, which is actually facing the south side. Okay, that's your northern facade. So you can actually see the skylights which are there on the top, which will lit the internal spaces. The windows are being recessed a little bit inside. And then it has this whole paved area, and then they have these ancillary spaces, which are like these stepped gardens with the water body and things like that around. That's the internal court, and that's the staircase with an internal courtyard that happens. Okay, that's how the daylight comes in. And this actually has a skylight right at the top, which is there. So it actually talks about extra thickness reduces the heat gain from the roof. So you actually create ground covers on the roof, which lessens the environmental impact. So talking about design criteria in the moderate zone are to reduce the heat gains, definitely. So how do you do it? One is that you create this thickened slab so that the absorption capacity of the roof itself is thickened. You use highly reflective surfaces on the top, and you also introduce greenery, okay, which also acts like a insulation point so that the energies of the outside doesn't enter the spaces below. So you must have always heard that the topmost houses will actually have higher AC bills compared to the lower houses. That is because there is a lot of exchange of energy that happens from the roof, and because of which you need to insulate the roof, because then the insulation does, it doesn't allow the energies to mingle. It keeps the two spaces as separate spaces. So whatever fluctuation that happens in the exterior, it's being taken care of because of the insulation. So that's the section through your building, which talks about, this is that open drain which is there. Okay, that's how the air enters. So you actually brush the air, you make it enter through it goes over the building, and then it because there is negative pressure that is created, it exits out. Okay, so it kinds of a convective loop that happens around the building. Now that happens only because if you see the way that light atrium is, and it's not pointing out towards the windward direction. If it would be pointing it out towards the windward direction, then it would capture the hot air right there and then entered the building, and some of the spaces wouldn't have been ventilated well. So that's why it also becomes very important that how do you create these kinds of uh, instances within your building so that it captures the air where exactly you want it to be. Also, the kind of berming that happens where the tree is and the kind of slope that you create, it also tends to create a microclimate. So the ground surface is much more moistened and there is grass. So there is so a lot of heat is going to get absorbed by the tree and the vegetation and not radiate out. So you actually rule out the whole idea of the urban heat island effect. This is another one which actually talks about how the daylight enters through. Building in the south wall was treated as an independent system, linking the rarer walls of the building over a cavity. So, if you see onto the top side, left side, there is a T that happens, okay? That is also called the stack effect that has been created because the atriums also heat up, okay? So, that enters the air. So imagine that the air that blows over the building is also being captured and let out through the atrium. Okay, because the atrium is going to be hot spaces. So these sections will work differently during your seasonal changes that is happening. So what it talks about that the entire system works very effectively in generating the desired reverse wind circulation. The black wall carries a clad with black kadappa. The color black was deliberately chosen because of its heat absorptive power, which is the highest among all the colors. So the whole black body principle. The working of the system is very simple. The sun rays heat the black south wall, increasing the temperatures of immediate environment around. This causes the air in the cavity to rise upwards through conventional means. So hot air is always lighter and that's how it's going to be rising up. These conventional currents are pulled up by the natural winds blowing south to north. This creates a vacuum at the top core of the structure. To fill this vacuum, air from the inside is drawn up, which is again pulled up by moving conventional currents. So for example, okay, I'll show you here. It's much more easier. It's saying nothing but, can you see this thick line which is there as an L where the man is standing? That is your Kadappa and that is facing the south. Now your wind is coming to the south and because it's heated up, it's going to all rise up. So when the heat is rising up, it actually creates a blockage. So the air can't enter through that area. So what it does, it pushes up and then it enters backwards because this second atrium creates this venturi effect for it. Okay, and that's how it functions. Any questions so far?
So when we're dealing with, sorry.
Yeah, say.
So when we're dealing with water bodies, like in the wedding hall, for example,
Mm.
how does that? Hold on. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
So like when we're dealing with water bodies, like in the wedding hall,
Huh?
how exactly would you like that? Would that require any adjustments to your services? Because it wouldn't be so simple to just put a water body directly in the structure,
Yes,
right?
so services, if you see, if I can go back to the plan, what happens is Shravan, see the where the water body is kept and where the services are going to be. It's going to be completely on the other side. And also you can actually replenish, you can recycle your wastewater and get into the water body. So if I have to check this plan, huh? So look at the toilets which are being placed there. They are not any close proximity to your water body. And
Right.
that's why the C section. And it actually recycles the water and enters the water body because water body is just a feature here. It's not a swimming pool or something like that where people are going to go and dip. It's just a feature which is adding to your microclimate.
Okay.
So that yeah. So and these toilets are also, if you see, there are these corridors. So these will be mechanically ventilated, but because it has an external corridor that happens, because of which there will be a ventilator and the daylight can come in. But they will be mechanically ventilated. And also we are talking about Japan. So the climate plays a very important role. These kinds of things in India might not work because sorry, I won't say it might not work. It will only work when you rely on the mechanical ventilation systems.
So would this have any kind of water filtration system and
Yes. Yes.
it would. That
Yes.
would be mechanical.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Well, any more questions, guys?